You can play most of the Five Nights at Freddy's games without ever having an understanding of what the MCI or Missing Children incident is. I mean, it is a huge event in the lore, but it's never really laid out for us in the games. Each game in the series seems to give us a little more information and clues to help in solving one of the greatest tragedies in the story. But with the information we have at the time, can it be solved? In this video, I'm going to be uncovering the truth behind the MCI, including the exact date it took place as well as the order of the victims' deaths, and understanding all parts of this mysterious tragedy, rewriting parts of the established narrative that may have been misconceived. So what do we know definitively about the MCI? Well, according to the newspapers in FNaF 1, really our only explicit source, we know that initially 2 children were captured on video being lured into a back room. This happened at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza during the late hours of operation on June 26th. We also know that the man responsible was caught on video and was captured the following morning. The victims' bodies were never found and were presumed dead. Eventually, a total of 5 children were linked to the incident. Now let's make some reasonable assumptions. Assuming this article was published shortly after the incident occurred, which is generally how this kind of news would be shared, the video footage had to have shown something provocative to imply that the victims were killed, since they seem to have been assumed dead rather quickly. Although the way this article is worded, it's possible that this report didn't come out until some time after the incident, with phrases like "on the night of June 26th" and "were never found," indicating that it may have happened sometime in the past. If this report was from only a few days after, it's curious that the victims would have been presumed dead so suddenly. Although the FBI reports that 70% of missing persons turn up within 72 hours of being declared missing, and after that the odds of them being found decrease dramatically. So with the video footage identifying the last known location of the victims being a back room, if police searched that small room and after 3 days no bodies were found, they would most likely assume them to be deceased. Also, FNaF 3's cassettes tell us that the safe rooms, presumably the same type of room as the one mentioned in the paper, are never on camera, which provides context as to why they didn't know exactly what happened to the victims after they entered that room. Another intriguing detail worth speculating about is that initially only 2 children were reported missing, and only later were a total of 5 linked to the incident. In the newspaper that reveals the total of 5 missing children, the MCI is referred to as the incident at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, which seems to group all of these disappearances together in an event that may have happened all in one night. That begs the question, if 5 children went missing on the same night, why were only 2 of them initially reported on? Given that these are children, you'd think that their parents would report them missing before leaving the restaurant. Then again, it was most likely the early 80s, so some parents may have given their children more freedom and trusted them to come home whenever they get hungry or whatever. I mean, less than 50 years ago, it wasn't uncommon for homeowners to leave their doors unlocked depending on where they lived. So is this detail important to solving the story? Probably not, but I like to check these kind of things out to see if they can tell us anything that we may have failed to see at first. This could insinuate that the video surveillance didn't capture all of the victims on camera, meaning that they couldn't link the other 3 missing kids to the incident until later. That's just one possible theory, and since I don't think this detail is relevant to our current topic, I'm not going to spend much time discussing it in this video. We of course know that this incident happened at a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, as every newspaper conveniently refers to the restaurant by name, so that's no mystery. The question is, however, which Freddy Fazbear's Pizza did it happen at? In the game's continuity, there were at least 3 locations, one that featured the withered animatronics, one that featured the toy animatronics, and one that featured the FNaF 1 animatronics. This restaurant pretty much has to be the first location, the one that used the withered animatronics, since the training cassettes presumably from that restaurant mention events that are very similar to the way the MCI is described in the newspapers. Also, this is the only Freddy Fazbear's Pizza that we know used mascot suits, which is a pretty big detail in the description of the MCI. This is a simple part of the mystery, however, I want to note that there could be more than just 3 Freddy Fazbear's Pizza restaurants in continuity, although the games only explicitly refer to 3 or 4 Freddy's restaurants. I tend to combine the restaurant mentioned in FNaF 2, the origin of the withered animatronics, with the one we hear about in FNaF 3's training cassettes, since they're both older than the FNaF 2 location. However, there isn't much evidence, if any, that these are the same restaurants. We do know that the first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza opened in 1983, and that the restaurant phone guy mentions in FNaF 2 was left to rot for quite a while, which could very well explain the 4 years between that restaurant and FNaF 2's. Plus, these 2 restaurants are described similarly, both with details that align with the description of the restaurant in the FNaF 1 newspapers. So are the FNaF 3 cassettes from the restaurant the withered animatronics originated from? I believe so, but there is room for this to be eventually disproven. Another pretty obvious detail is the fact that the victims did die, and that their bodies were put into the original animatronics. You could argue that this isn't really speculative, but it's never explicitly said in any of the games. Many times we've gotten close to a full admission, like when Henry says, "I don't know how those tiny breaths of life came to inhabit those machines." But until the day William comes out and says it, I'm I'm going to remain as objective as possible. As to where this idea comes from, many sources like the Silver Eyes trilogy and the FNAF movie directly state that the victims are inside the animatronics. And as far as the game's continuity goes, it's been implied many times, through FNAF 6's gravestones to Give Gifts Give Life. At this point, that detail is pretty much confirmed. We also have good reason to believe that William Afton is the man responsible for the MCI, as shown in Foxy Go 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 when the purple guy stands next to a room of 5 corpses, as well as being vaguely described by Henry in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator. I don't think anyone is arguing against William being the purple guy, but feel free to comment if you think I glossed over anything. So we know the who, the what, and the where, but we haven't yet discussed arguably the most important and unknown detail: when. Since we've already agreed that the MCI happened at the first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, that would place the MCI somewhere between the restaurant's opening in 1983 and 1987 when we get confirmation that it's closed. Due to the book's placement of the MCI in 1985, some people take this as confirmation that the game's MCI also happened in 1985. However, with the books not necessarily being in the same continuity as the games, I'm not going to use this as evidence in my theory. So let's gather everything we know about the story before 1987 and filter through the information that's relevant to our focus. Unfortunately, we only really have one game in continuity that takes place in this range, or rather, half of a game. While FNAF 1 through 4 all take place outside of our range, FNAF 4's minigames are widely accepted to be set in 1983, when Fredbear's Family Diner was still open. So could the MCI have occurred during the events of these minigames? Technically yes, but most likely not. Both Fredbear's Family Diner and this era's Freddy Fazbear's Pizza use springlock suits, as made evident in FNAF 4's minigames and FNAF 3's cassettes respectively. In one of the training cassettes from FNAF 3, we hear about a change of company policy that bans springlock suits from being used in the restaurant. The exact words are, "The company has deemed the suits temporarily unfit for employees. Safety is top priority at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, which is why the classic suits are being retired." As much as the word temporarily tries to throw us off, we can pretty much assume that after this, the springlocks were never used again, at least not in commercial use. The suits were likely permanently banned at this point, at least in Freddy Fazbear's Pizza restaurants. The tape is pretty vague when explaining this new policy, so we don't know exactly how extensive it was or whether it applied to only Freddy's Pizzerias or to all Fazbear Entertainment properties, but we know that the reason for the policy change had to do with a springlock incident at the sister location. I could open a can of worms here, but I don't think we need all of those worms. You see, this line about a springlock failure at a sister location may seem complicated at first, since there is a game called Sister Location that discusses an entertainment venue similar to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza that used at least one springlock suit, with mention of a controversial incident involving that suit. However, there are a few reasons why I believe Fredbear's Diner is the sister location these tapes refer to. First, Circus Baby's Pizza World and Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental for that matter aren't sister locations of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. They belong to Afton Robotics LLC, as seen in the animatronics blueprints. Second, these tapes refer to this location as the sister location, implying that it was the only one, or else it would be worded as a sister location or something like that. Adding on this, we know that Fredbear's was opened in 1983, as shown in FNAF 4's minigames, and I have reason to believe that the FNAF 3 cassettes, or at least one of them, and FNAF 4 minigames occur simultaneously, meaning that these two restaurants were open at the same time. So if Freddy Fazbear's Pizza only had one sister location at the time, it would have to have been Fredbear's Family Diner. Full disclosure, the minigames and cassettes never make mention of Fazbear Entertainment. The FNAF wiki claims that Fazbear Entertainment was founded at this point, sometime in 1983, probably as soon as Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was opened. But either way, this shouldn't be that important. I just wanted to highlight this because it could mean that Fredbear's Family Diner and Freddy Fazbear's Pizza were not necessarily incorporated at this time, but that doesn't mean they couldn't be sister locations. A small but interesting detail in support of this theory has to do with that one specific line, the sister location. In FNAF 2, we learn that Phone Guy is unfamiliar with Fredbear's Family Diner, as he mentions its name alone with uncertainty. This aligns with the idea that he is describing Fredbear's Diner in these cassettes, referring to it as the sister location rather than by its actual name. I always assumed that he was once familiar with the diner, but after years of it being closed, it faded from his memory. But these tapes seem to indicate that he may never have known much more than the fact that Freddy's had a sister location. That much isn't really relevant to this video, but the main point is that Phone Guy's patterns of speech support the idea that Fredbear's Family Diner is the sister location of discussion. While this theory seems solid at the moment, we should revisit a detail that I briefly mentioned earlier. The policy change was prompted by a series of simultaneous springlock failures at the company's sister location. According to our working theory, these springlock failures must have happened at Fredbear's Family Diner, but we might have evidence that says otherwise. You see, a lot of what we hear in FNAF 3's cassettes aligns with what we see in FNAF 4's minigames, meaning that they most likely took place within the same week. This also means that we can use each source to solve the other. The cassettes tell us that springlock suits were being used up until a springlock failure at the sister location. After that, we are told that the suits were retired to an appropriate location, which appears to have been the safe room in Freddy Fazbear's Pizza's case. Now, in FNAF 4's minigames, we see springlock suits being used by employees, which implies that the policy change has not yet taken effect, until a few days later when the suits are no longer seen on the floor. Even more interesting is when the next day, the crying child is locked in in a closet with multiple empty Springlock suits. This seems to imply that the Springlock incident that caused the policy change happened during these minigames, but we don't see anything that indicates that in FNAF 4. From what we see in the minigames, the Springlock failure would have taken place between nights 2 and 3, which is problematic because the crying child is at the restaurant on both of these days without any mention or indication that anything disastrous had happened. This is especially strange because whatever happened was scary enough for the company to deem the suits unfit and too unsafe to continue being used, so you'd think the incident would be a big deal. In all fairness, when explaining how to operate the Springlock suits in the training cassettes, Phone Guy does advise performers to maneuver away from customers in the event of a Springlock failure, so they could have covered up something like that, but it seems unlikely that it could be pulled off so seamlessly. So the only reason we even have to entertain this idea is because the Springlock suits seem to have been discontinued sometime in between these minigames. Conveniently, these minigames take place day after day, so it's pretty easy to see the story unfold, unlike the cassettes which may have dramatic spacing between some of the tapes. So how can we prove that the Springlock incident happened during these minigames? Well, with the information we have, we can really only speculate. However, we don't need to be confident that the Springlock failure happened during these minigames, or even that it happened at Fredbear's family diner. All we need to be sure of is that the MCI hasn't happened yet when the Night 3 minigame takes place. Going off of what we've just established, it appears that Fredbear's family diner stopped using Springlock suits during these minigames. That would indicate that the policy change has taken effect, meaning that the Night 4 cassette was likely recorded around the same time as the Night 3 or 4 minigame, since we know the suits were being used the day before Night 3. That places the cassettes and minigames on a timeline relevant to each other, and while we don't know exactly when each of them take place, we know that at least some of the cassettes were recorded in 1983. Here's where this becomes extremely important to us. FNAF 1's newspapers describe a man dressed as a cartoon mascot being involved in the MCI, and the training cassettes insinuate that it happened sometime after the policy change. Since the policy change seems to take effect on Night 3, unless 2 of the training cassettes were recorded on the same day, the MCI couldn't have happened before then. This tells us that the MCI would have had no impact on what we see in Night 3. This needed to be established because my theory hinges on what we see in the Fredbear and Friends cartoon on Night 3, and if the MCI could have affected this TV show, my theory could be proven wrong. However, since it is extremely unlikely that the cassette describing the policy change was recorded on the same day as the one describing the MCI, we have a vital piece of information to use. In Fredbear and Friends, we see several characters from Fredbear's Family Diner and Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, namely Fredbear, Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, but not Spring Bonnie. This becomes relevant when we look back to the FNAF 1 newspaper describing a cartoon mascot. Since we know the mascot in this case was a wearable suit, and since the training cassettes confirm that this restaurant only had 2 suits, presumably Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, Fredbear is the only possible candidate for this cartoon mascot, since he's the only character who's both a wearable suit and cartoon mascot. Trust me, I know I'm going against the grain when it comes to the generally accepted headcanon of the MCI, but let me explain further why Spring Bonnie was not the suit used in the MCI. The newspapers tell us that the man responsible was identified using video surveillance and was captured and charged. While this seems to imply William was identified, he couldn't have been jailed because he's still around in 1987 and presumably 1993. So how could he have pulled this off? According to the Silver Eyes, Spring Bonnie was William's designated suit and Fredbear was Henry's. Given that we already have evidence in support of Fredbear being involved in the MCI, let's apply that to this scenario and solve around it. Using evidence from the games, the Silver Eyes, and the FNAF movie, we know that William is our killer. So why would he use Henry's costume and how did he evade justice? Before answering that, I want to bring up another detail. One of the training cassettes describes Spring Bonnie being noticeably moved before alluding that an employee had taken customers out of the main show area and into a back room. That seems to be describing the MCI, where a mascot suit was used to lure customers into a back room. But these tapes imply it was Spring Bonnie rather than Fredbear, right? Let's read between the lines. All that we know for sure is that management noticed that Spring Bonnie was moved, which doesn't necessarily mean it had been used in the restaurant. Obviously, it's right to assume that the mention of the suit being used combined with the suggestion that customers were lured into a back room implies that Spring Bonnie was used for that purpose. But the FNAF 1 newspapers imply that it was Fredbear. This is the one part of the story that doesn't seem to add up. However, this doesn't necessarily discredit the theory. First off, even if this cassette was explicitly saying that Spring Bonnie was responsible for the MCI, it would still clash with the FNAF 1 newspapers claiming it was a cartoon mascot, which Spring Bonnie is evidently not. And since it isn't explicitly stated that Spring Bonnie was used to lure customers, this line could have been completely misinterpreted. To get a better understanding of what this claim means, we have to look outside of that one sentence for context. This is just a reminder of company policy concerning the safe room. This is not a break room and should not be considered a place for employees to hide and or congregate, and under no circumstance should a customer ever be taken into this room and out of the main show area. Management has also been made aware that the Spring Bonnie animatronic has noticeably been moved. We would like to remind employees that this costume is not safe to wear under any circumstances. Back to our explicit-implicit routine, the only relevant details we know with absolute certainty are that customers are not allowed out in the safe room, the Spring Bonnie animatronic was moved, and that it is not safe to wear that Spring Bonnie costume. So omitting all the assumed details, we are left with a completely different context. In this case, the mention of Spring Bonnie being unsafe to wear could simply be foreshadowing the end of night minigames from the same game, providing context to the scene where William encounters a spring lock failure after donning the rabbit suit. The previous cassettes already mentioned that the suits were being retired for being unsafe, but this tape specifically calls out Spring Bonnie as being dangerous, which may just be an instance of dramatic irony. For that theory to be true, we do have to neglect some of the implicit details such as Spring Bonnie being moved after it was used and the suggestion that employees were hiding or congregating in the safe room. But again, those details require a bit of guesswork to fit into our narrative. In contrast, the main evidence I'm using to support my theory comes from explicit sources, such as secondhand accounts of the MCI through era-relevant newspaper articles, not details that may be suggested in vague recordings monitored by a shady corporation known for its cover-ups and blatant lies. Respectfully. Now, before I came to that conclusion, I was writing a narrative in which William moved the suit in order to cover his tracks when he later frames Henry for the murders. While I don't think that's as solid anymore, here's another possible theory for anyone who's not willing to look past the implications of Spring Bonnie being moved. What if William took Spring Bonnie out of the restaurant as a cover while using Fredbear to commit the murders? We know that at some point William was learning robotics as he developed the Funtime animatronics independently of Henry. Being one of the company's owners, William could justify taking one of the animatronics, which we know were supposed to be looked at by technicians anyways. This could give him an alibi when he later uses Fredbear in the crimes. So when management finds out that the Spring Bonnie animatronic has been moved, William can explain that he took it to be looked at. Then with the alibi of working on the suit, he sneakily returns to the restaurant, and while Henry is busy, William dons his partner's mascot costume and lures 5 children into a back room, perhaps even purposely appearing in front of surveillance cameras in the suit to frame Henry. We know that video surveillance identified the man responsible for the MCI as reported in the newspaper, but that couldn't have been William. According to these papers, this man was captured and charged for these crimes. The heading even reads suspect convicted. Since William obviously wasn't convicted for these crimes, perhaps this suspect was identified based on the animatronic suit seen in the surveillance footage, Henry Emily's costume. Henry describes what can only be interpreted as the events of Follow Me in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria simulator, saying he lured them all back to a familiar place, back with familiar tricks. I explained this in my Follow Me theory, but I believe that FNaF 1 takes place in an updated version of the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, the one that cassettes originate from. This explains how Springtrap was found in a safe room that was sealed with Spring Bonnie inside it until William reopened it after FNaF 1. Using this logic, we can understand Henry's quote. William lured the animatronics, or spirits, back to a familiar place, the safe room, using familiar tricks, luring them in a mascot costume. Yes, I think that Shadow Freddy, or at least in Follow Me, is a mascot costume rather than an agony creature or something else. As we know, William has pretty much always been shown as purple in minigames, along with anything that's in the shadows. So William in the Fredbear suit could absolutely appear purple in this dark, decrepit restaurant. Shadow Freddy can also enter the safe room, which is something that animatronics cannot do on their own due to their programming prohibiting it. And why would Shadow Freddy lead the animatronics to William? It doesn't make sense unless, like Henry said, William is using his old tricks to lure the spirits back to the safe room in a mascot costume, the same mascot costume he used in the MCI. As for when the MCI took place, there's really no way to be 100% sure, but we can make a pretty reasonable estimation. The FNaF 1 newspaper titled Local Pizzeria said to close by year's end describes a tragedy that took place at the restaurant many years ago, saying that it has announced that it would close by the end of the year. Since Phone Guy implies in FNaF 2 that the old restaurant is closed, that would set the latest year that it could still have been opened as 1987, the year when Phone Guy suggested it's closed. The earliest it could have closed would technically be 1983, the same year it opened. So with a range of 1983 to 1987, how do we get closer to an exact year of closure? This newspaper tells us that the tragedy, which based on the context of the other papers would be the MCI, took place many years ago, and that the restaurant would close by the end of the year. The latest this newspaper could have been published would be 1987, and if the MCI took place many years ago, we know that it was at least more than 1 year ago, but more than likely upwards of 3. I think everyone would agree that many would be a weird way to describe 2 items in a set, but even 4 seems kind of low for the word. Anyways, we have to work with what we have, and given that the most many could refer to is 5 years, we have to be a bit generous when using this ambiguous word to pinpoint the year of the MCI. While I think that 5 years ago is the most reasonable context in this case, it is possible that 3 or 4 could still apply since we don't really know what many means in this case. From my understanding of this statement, I would place the MCI 5 years ago in 1983, even though 4 years ago in 1984 is still possible. Aside from this very circumstantial evidence, we know for a fact that someone used a yellow suit to do something criminal in the restaurant from FNaF 2 only weeks after it opened. We can only assume that event was the DCI as shown in the same game, which is another MCI-like incident in which 5 victims were killed inside of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. So given William's track record of committing murders somewhat spontaneously, and psychologically a lot of serial killers have uncontrollable compulsions that cause them to act out when an opportunity arises, we can reasonably conclude that he did something similar at the first restaurant, committing a series of murders in the first year of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza being opened. Using this theory, that places the MCI on June 26, 1983, which aligns with one of the common candidates, those being 1983 and 1985. Given our theory regarding the description of many years ago, I think 1983 is far more likely than 1985. The final piece of this puzzle is an answer to the most important question: why? As much as we love Five Nights at Freddy's and all of its characters, things would have been objectively better if William had never stepped into the yellow suit on that fateful night. Considering the placement of the MCI on the timeline, we know that William's youngest son had died prior. As implied by sister location, William speaks as his Fredbear plush in a somber tone, vowing to put him back together. Based on this, it's reasonable to conclude that William commits the string of murders in hopes of bringing his son back to life. While we can't be certain, Charlie Emily may have also died prior to the MCI. If this were the case, William could have observed the puppet's behavior after coming in contact with Charlie's body, giving him a corrupt form of hope. I also believe that William was responsible for putting his victims into the animatronics, not the puppet. While the minigame Give Gifts Give Life seems to show that it was the puppet, we know that these minigames are rough representations of the events they depict and often more symbolic than literal. Take for example Take Cake to the Children, which we later find out had nothing to do with a room full of hungry kids nor Freddy. Foxy Go 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 is another prime example, since it's not very realistic to believe that William appeared without his mascot suit disguise and leaves 5 corpses in the middle of the Pirates Cove show area. If William did stuff the suits himself, this could have been him experimenting in an attempt to recreate the environment that turned Charlie into the puppet, the only time he'd ever seen someone come back to life. This might be something I delve into deeper in another video, but Give Gifts Give Life also shows that the 5th victim was never given a gift or a suit, but somehow receives life anyways, becoming Golden Freddy. Perhaps before this 5th victim was put into a suit, William had solved the mystery of possession by not directly putting them into an animatronic. While we're still looking at this minigame, I think there's one more thing it can tell us about the MCI. Using this minigame, as well as information from FNaF 3, I believe we can solve the order in which these victims were killed. To get FNaF 3's good ending, in which most of the animatronics are finally set to rest, the player has to enter a code into a series of buttons in a square arrangement. Applying this combination to Give Gifts Give Life, using each victim as the buttons, we have the following order: Chica, Bonnie, Freddy, Foxy, or Susie, Jeremy, Gabriel, Fritz. Now this correlation is a bit random, but this order seems to be partially corroborated by Ultimate Custom Night, where Chica says, "I was the first, I have seen everything." Most people take this to mean that she was William's first victim, whether that refers to his entire career or specifically the MCI. Since the order we've developed does have Chica as the first victim, this order can be considered highly probable. Back to the why. Other sources in FNaF media make it clear that William was incredibly jealous of Henry for getting most of the recognition for the restaurant's success, which could also explain why he killed Charlie and framed Henry for the MCI. In the case of the FNaF movie, he's just a bad, cruel man. Okay, I'm never using FNaF movie evidence again. All jokes aside, no matter what William's motive for the murders was, he's clearly not in his right mind. Whether it be from his son's death or the constant shadow Henry had been casting over him, William lost his mind along the path to success. We know that Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was, at a time, a massive success, and it seems that William let the environment corrupt him to the point where he was beyond saving. Even his business partner and good friend Henry realized that William had stepped too far into the deep end, and he would not return the same man. Did we finally get to the truth to solving the MCI? It's hard to say, but we definitely learned a lot and provided some new perspectives to a long debated conversation. There's still details that could help support this theory that I may not have included. I'd love to hear some other theories or thoughts that support or disprove this theory. Of course, there's always a lot of guesswork that goes into solving FNaF lore, but I hope that I provided the evidence necessary to explain how I got to all of my conclusions. I know some of these ideas are controversial and radical, and all I ask is that you always listen to my side before assuming I'm wrong because it's not what another creator is saying. The truth is still the truth, even if no one believes it. Thanks for watching.
This drink, I like it.
I know, it's great, right?
Another!